Cabron, I need to see you a ball.
What's going on? This is Pseychie, and while we wait for the next update, I thought I'd come in with an unexpected weapon showcase. Today we'll be taking a look at the Wrecking Ball. Originally, I didn't really like the weapon because it was too slow and I didn't really enjoy its playstyle, but it definitely has some unheard potentials, so I'm willing to give it another try. In this run, I'm going to be using the Wrecking Ball primarily, and then just using everything else to support it. It's a pretty straightforward survival weapon. It hits hard, and that's really all you needed to do. It has 4 attacks in its combo, and while the Beheaded is like dragging the ball around, if you hit the 3rd attack, he launches the ball forward, and then you can recall it with the 4th. And when you recall it, that's when it does the critical damage. So they've definitely nailed a lot of things regarding this weapon aesthetically. For example, if you just swing with the weapon, like any attack in its combo, then the entire ground shakes. So it definitely feels like you're swinging this hefty ball around. So what I'm doing here is basically charging up the shot, where you initiate with the 1st and 2nd strike, and then when you're coming up against the elite, you can launch it and then call it back, because the recall does an absurd amount of damage if you can actually hit something with it. It's mainly the reason why I think the gimmick of the Wrecking Ball is quite nice. I just wish there was an easier way to launch the ball, because I definitely think that is what makes this weapon so special. So yeah, we're gonna head to the Arboretum. Now normally you would think this is not a good idea because the Wrecking Ball is technically a melee weapon. However, because the Wrecking Ball is technically not connected to the Beheaded, as in it's connected by a chain, you can actually hit those Thornies without worrying about getting hit yourself. So that's a pretty neat detail that they put in there. And then one more detail is that you can actually break those floors where you originally ground slam into them. So I think there's a few weapons in the game that can do that, and Wrecking Ball happens to be one of them. Again, it's a cool detail, and it really sells the concept of swinging this giant ball of lead that's twice the size of your body. We're gonna take up the Berserker mutation, and then I'm playing on the alpha patch on the new update, so some things might not be finalized. But what's really cool is that, as you can see above my head, you can see how many stacks of the damage resistance you get from Berserker now, which is quite nice. I've actually done like 1 or 2 runs with it previously, just to kind of get a feel of the weapon itself. So a lot of these slower survival weapons feel different from the rest of the game, because a lot of the times you actually have to time whenever you initiate an attack. So what I mean by this is a lot of the tactics weapons, such as, I don't know, magic missile or throwing knife, you can just spam the attack button and then every single projectile just comes out really fast. But after playing a lot of these hack and slash games in the past year, I played the Yakuza games, I've also played Devil May Cry 5, and what's something I realized is that a lot of the really cool combos that you can do, it depends on the player input, as in how many times you press the attack button, because if you just spam it, then it's not really clear to the system or the game of how many inputs that you did. So you can't see my controller, but how I like to imagine when you're playing these survival weapons is that you press the button once, the attack comes out, you press it again if you think it's safe to do so, or you roll away. It's not a weapon that you spam, because you could be initiating an attack where you really didn't want to, and there is an end leg on the attack where you actually can't roll to cancel out of it, so you're actually stuck in doing the attack until it's completed. So once again, it's this layer of complexity where the game tests you whether or not you think it's safe for you to roll or commit to the attack. So a lot of these elites, what I like to do is to just charge up the recall critical hit. And as you can see, I'm not perfect with this weapon, so you will see me get hit every now and then. But it just goes to show that essentially you just have to judge whether or not you are within safe timings to actually get out the attack. And then once something really cool, I'm not sure if you saw it with that lead, but when you recall the Wrecking Ball on the last hit, if the enemy happens to be right beside you, the Wrecking Ball will actually deal 2 ticks of critical hits, which increases its damage dramatically. Now, I'm not sure why it's not stated on the tooltip because that would have been really nice to know, but it is something that's quite cool, and obviously you're not going to see it a lot because a lot of the enemies just die in like 1 or 2 hits anyways. But once we get to the first boss, but you can really see how this gimmick comes into play. So I took a couple of hits back in the Arboretum, but because the Berserker mutation just does a really good job of reducing your damage, my health total is still sitting quite comfortably. So I really have to be careful with the curse here. Essentially, I was gonna freeze a couple enemies here and there, and then you'll see me do some really cool shots with the recall. So that being said, I've talked about how a lot of these survival weapons requires you to think differently versus a lot of the other weapons in the game. So I was going to make a video, like a PSA, regarding these slow melee weapons and what are some possible misconceptions about them. The truth is, if anyone thinks they're weak, they're wrong. You look at weapons like the Toothpick, the Oven Axe, and the Wrecking Ball, they are strong weapons. I'm not denying that. From an objective standpoint, they are strong weapons. That is, assuming you can get out its full potential. And unlike a lot of the other weapons, where it depends on the synergies you have, so for example, if you have like the Vampire Killer, it's not really how you use the Vampire Killer, it's mainly about how you group up the Vampire Killer with other synergies. But these survival weapons are generally more mechanically demanding, meaning you have to spend a bit more time trying to figure them out. They may seem weak at first because they have a higher skill ceiling. And obviously if you don't like this style of gameplay, then you shouldn't have to be forced to master. But the bottom line, what I'm trying to say is, these weapons are not weak. They require more time to figure them out and get the most out of it, if that even makes sense. Some people might enjoy taking the time and mastering a weapon, and some people such as myself like to play a version of Dead Cells where no 2 runs feel the same. Because there's like over 100 weapons in the game at this point. And in the past couple years, I think a lot of the weapons came off to me as somewhat similar to ones that we already had. But obviously if you get into the nitty-gritty of a particular weapon, there are some gimmicks that set it apart from other ones. So I'm just gonna ignore that elite there because I really didn't want to deal with it. And then I'm going to go into the Morass. So I'm gonna pick up the new version of the Diverse deck. So in this version, particularly I'm gonna be using Foresight because it's still really busted. But instead of having a timer of 15 seconds to refresh the invincibility, you have to kill 8 enemies. So while it is a bit harder to get off the invincibility, having an unconditional ice armor that doesn't expire is extremely busted. And in this biome I definitely had my doubts about whether or not this was the right choice. But I didn't feel too confident with this survival weapon, so I thought it was safe to try to gear up on food and potions. And plus, if I went to Conjunctivius, it probably wouldn't be too comfortable of a fight, since you're just gonna be flying all over the place. So yeah, you just gotta take it slow. I'm just gonna freeze enemies every now and then. And with the damage reduction from Berserker, you can actually take a pretty big amount of damage before needing to fill up a health flask. Obviously, sometimes you will run into the problem of enemies teleporting away, like those blowgunners, because the Wrecking Ball just isn't fast enough. But that is what Throwable Objects is for. It's essentially the premier support weapon for a lot of these survival playstyles. And in the late game, it actually does so much damage, where you can essentially clear biomes with it by itself, which is pretty insane. So with the Wrecking Ball, when your avatar lands the attack, as in when it hits the ground where it hits an enemy, there's a brief moment where you can't roll or dodge. Essentially, you're basically stuck in that animation, and if an enemy happens to be attacking you while you're in that animation, then you are going to be getting hit. So that is essentially a lot of the things you have to watch out for when you're playing these weapons. And I am going to use the invincibility from Foresight every now and then, and surprisingly, it actually does not disturb your kill streak. So right now, I still have 79 kills, and even then I got hit by that little laser beam. It didn't actually count it as a hit. So this may just be something the alpha version of the patch didn't consider, is that they may have changed the logic of Foresight. But maybe it just was like this previously, because I never really used Foresight extensively in the previous patches, though I'm pretty sure getting hit by it would still reset your kill streak. There is a mutation in the game that does something similar. It's called gold plating, and essentially it takes away your gold instead of taking away your health, if you have any gold at all, obviously. And if you're hit while being cursed with gold plating, I think you still die. So I'm not sure if this logic is exclusive to Foresight, or it's just something that the new patch hasn't figured out yet. So against these giant tick enemies, I'm basically just stunning them, and I'm trying to get off the recall attack because that is the one that deals the real damage. But once we get to the Mama Tick fight, we'll really get to see the full potential of the Wrecking Ball, because you really just need one good swing to kill off most enemies. And then with this curse, I made sure to count that there are at least 10 enemies on the map. I'm basically just hunting enemies at the 4 corners of the map, so you'll see me speed up the footage a little bit. I'm basically just looking for freebie kills at this point. So yeah, regarding the plan I have for this run, I'm probably just going to be going to the default final areas. I know they'd actually added Death and Dracula in the training rooms, but I just wasn't feeling too confident with this build. So, I mean, as long as you can clear the game, then it doesn't really matter, right? But regards to what I'm doing right now, I'm actually doing surprisingly well. And I'm gonna do the same thing I did before, so you can charge up the first 2 strikes in the combo, and then when you're encountering an elite, just throw out the ball and then recall it back. So I'm going to showcase what I've been meaning when I say that when you recall it while the enemy's right next to you, it will actually deal 2 ticks of damage. Like, it essentially doubles your damage output. It's cool to see, and I think that's a pretty neat solution to the boss damage cap problem that the game may be having. You can only deal so much damage to a boss in a single instance of damage, and what's really interesting about a lot of DLT builds, because the damage ticks are so quick but they're smaller, it's able to melt through the bosses really quickly. And then what's really cool about the Wrecking Ball is that if you recall it while enemies are right next to you, you deal 2 instances of damage. Meaning it's a cool idea to find a way to bypass the damage cap, because you're essentially hitting 2 times instead of just once. So I'm going to get rid of these throwable objects because it doesn't really work in this fight, and there's only a limited amount of uses. But as you can see, if you can pull up the full combo, it does so much damage. And then I was stunned for a little second there because I actually got hit during that fight, but the game still gave me the no hit, which allowed me to gain a legendary phaser. So again, I'm not sure if it's supposed to work like that. I'm pretty sure it's not supposed to, but hey, I actually didn't know it was gonna do that, so I'm just gonna take what I can get. But yeah, I totally just no-hit Mama Tick there with the Wrecking Ball. So entering the second portion of the game, the only times when I had problems with damage is during the prison depths area, but since I was able to upgrade to a higher tier of the Wrecking Ball, you can go back to one-shotting everything with a single strike. So I wasn't too worried about damage at this point, and while the Wrecking Ball does have a bit of a range problem, since the ball doesn't actually extend out that wide, you can use certain skills. So in this case, the phaser actually works quite well because you're essentially grouping the enemies together. So once again, I'm gonna try to show off these cool recall attacks, as those are definitely gonna be the highlights of this run. So what's something really interesting you can do as you're playing it, as you just keep attacking with the ball, and essentially every now and then you will definitely find the opportunity where throwing it out is the next move in its combo, and it's something that you can do. So just like in this case, I finish off the enemies on the top floor with the first and second strikes, which means I get to do the cool recalling attack when I jump down to the platform below. So I'm taking the curse, and I definitely have to be careful with curses. I'm mainly just gonna get throwable objects to do the work for me, and then once I enter this room, I see that menacing looking elite up there, and then I just said, you know what, let's just go somewhere else. So yeah, I've definitely had my bad experiences dealing with elites when you're cursed. It's something that you should avoid if possible. At least just wait until you're done with the curse itself. So once again, the piercing effects on the throwable objects is just so good. And then something interesting is gonna happen here is that the kamikaze bat blows up, which lifts the curse. And then I was just sitting there stunned, like, so is that allowed? Like, am I allowed to do that? Does that actually count as a win? Because once again, I'm pretty sure if you use something like gold plating and you get hit while cursed, you will still die from the curse. But I mean, if the game considers that it's legit, then who am I to argue with, right? So we're gonna go to the Cavern, and what's something else that's quite cool about the Wrecking Ball is that it can actually break through shields. So against those Ovenites, against those shielded enemies, and even with these ground shakers, you can see how their backside is protected, but the Wrecking Ball just goes right through it, which is again something that the developers may have missed, but it is a cool detail that you can do that. It really sells the idea that you're swinging around a hefty ball of lead. And while it's slow, you can break through a lot of the enemy defenses. So this is the portion of the run where your damage is going to be the highest, and then a lot of the times, enemies just die so quickly that I won't actually have the time to do the recall attack. So a lot of these ground shakers, even though they're supposedly like the toughest enemies in the game, if I do like the throw attack with the third hit, then they're essentially just dead. And in this biome, I do believe I'm going to be upgrading my entire loadout, so it's going to be pretty interesting to see the full potentials of this build. So going forward, whenever new weapons are introduced in future updates, I'm definitely going to be more open-minded when covering these new weapons, even if the style that they offer may not be suited to the way that I personally play the game. But obviously everyone is biased. Anyone that says they're not is lying. So in a lot of media that I watch online, like on YouTube or movies or news outlets, I generally will try to find something that I disagree with, even if the information that they're putting out is generally something that I agree with. And if I see a piece of media that says something that I overall disagree with, at least try to find something that I will agree with in that information. Because I think the best way to approach a lot of things in life is to look at both sides of the argument. In pretty much all of my showcases, and I've definitely learned a lot of lessons doing these over the years, is that I'll try to paint a realistic picture of what the weapon is possible for the average Dead Cells player. So there's a reason why I don't cut out like the times where I get hit. Because I think even at the hardest difficulty, you still shouldn't be expected to play perfectly. And I am trying to show like every weapon is going to have its faults. And while you can objectively compare like the DPSs of certain weapons, when it comes to personal preference and your enjoyment of the game, any build and any weapon can beat the game. Like there's no weapon that's bad enough where you just can't beat the game with. With enough dedication, you can make anything work. And then coming into the Giant fight, I realized that Giant may not have been the best boss to showcase the Wrecking Ball since I have to hit his fists in midair. But I wanted to skip to Hand of the King because I am going to be going to the default route of the 5BC area and then the spoiler boss. So this fight's gonna drag on for a bit longer than I would have liked. And I know Phaser acts a little wonky in this fight, like sometimes they'll actually teleport you outside the arena and then you land in the lava or something. But once his eyeball comes out, I can do like the first 3 hits, but I can't do the last recall hit, which is a little unfortunate. And that's not an attack you see very often in the Giant fight. But luckily I have a shield. And once again, we're gonna quote-unquote no-hit the Giant, even though I really did take an instance of damage there. But I'm going to switch up my build and then use the legendary Scavenged Bombard. So the perks of going to the Giant is that you get to skip to Hand of the King. Hand of the King is a pretty good boss to showcase the Wrecking Ball in my opinion. And since the Bombard does a pretty good job of stunning the hand, I'm able to do the recall attack. And you can see like the real damage potential of it is quite insane. And what's something quite nice about the diverse stack is that since now you can't rely on waiting 15 seconds to get the invul again, the next card in the rotation of the deck is Barricade, which means even though you get hit, you actually still get a little bit of defense, since Barricade actually just gives you bonus health. So against the last stage of Hand of the King, I'm just gonna try to do the waiting game, try to do some parries here and there, and then he's gonna summon the flags, and then one last recall is going to do it. I did get tagged at the end there, but overall I felt pretty satisfied with this outcome. So yeah, we're gonna move on to the last portion of the game. If you don't want to see the 5BC content, this is definitely the portion of the run where you want to keep out. So going into the Astrolab, it's more or less the same thing, and going this route definitely makes me feel more confident than going to the Queen route, since the Astrolab actually has a food shop. These magistrates won't pose too much of a threat anymore, as the throwable objects, I believe, is a tier 12 one, so it's essentially strong enough to take out anything. But I do want to use the Wrecking Ball if I can, since this is a Wrecking Ball showcase. And even against those librarians, throwable objects just provides a really quick solution to it. And then against this Slammer Elite, again, I'm trying to just use the recall to kill it, as I think that's really what sells the weapon. There's really something satisfying about charging up a single strike and then just insta-killing the enemy. So I'm gonna try to do the same here, and then the failed experiment is gonna dodge at the last second. Like, come on, only the beheaded gets to do that. So reflecting back on some of the showcases I had of these survival weapons, I definitely remember showcasing the toothpick. And then I do remember I was pretty biased against it. I was saying how weak it is, but I think in that run I did actually have like 28 scrolls instead of 32. So damage is definitely something that gets better with exponential scaling, but I think 30 to 32 scrolls is like the usual amount that I end up with on 5BC runs. So as we're descending the tower, you can see that Wrecking Ball can have somewhat of a range problem, but it's nothing that a lot of support weapons can't fix. So as we're climbing up the tower, I'm just gonna try to get off as many recalls as I can, and I'm going to try to prep for the final boss. So I'm gonna do the cheese with the Slimers. By the way, this is something you can do, because I don't think I've visited the Astrolab in a while. We're gonna top up on health, and we're just gonna go in and face the final boss. For these boss encounters, you definitely do not want to be using the throwable objects, because it just doesn't work against the endgame bosses. So yeah, going into this fight, even though I wasn't too familiar with the Wrecking Ball's playstyle, I do feel quite confident that I can do this with relative ease. So on the deck, I switched to Barricade because there weren't enough enemies on the map for me to recharge the invincibility. But the Collector with a shield is considerably easier than without one. So a lot of his attacks you can just kind of parry, and with some swings with the ball as well as some parries from the Spike Shield, I was able to get his health down rather quickly. So once again, you can do the gimmick where you deal 2 instances of damage instead of 1, and it is going to increase your DPS output. Against the first couple phases of the Collector, you can do a pretty good amount of recalls with the ball itself. But once we get to like the later stage, that's when I was the most worried about, as the Collector doesn't really give you too long of a window to attack him. But as he is in the invincibility phase, I tried to prepare the critical hit, and it did actually do quite a lot of damage there. So this is essentially the portion of the fight where you really have to watch your surroundings. The Scavenge Bombard doesn't really help you stun the Collector anymore. So he's gonna get into his 3rd heal, and yeah, this is actually quite impressive because we don't get to see the Spike Ball phase. So if you stay in this fight for too long, he teleports you into a room where there's like a spinning ball that's flying around the room. Generally, if you can get to this portion of the fight without seeing that phase, then it is a good indicator that you're doing pretty good in this run. So he's gonna get me here, but honestly it doesn't really matter that much. I'm just gonna get the Panacea, and I think 1 or 2 swings is going to do it. Yeah, you just see that huge chunkster of damage, and the Collector is down. So I hope you enjoyed this unexpected showcase of the Wrecking Ball, and once again, I'm gonna try to be more open-minded regarding any weapons that may come out in the future. It's definitely better to get the full picture of a certain playstyle before letting your bias get the best of you. So once again, hope you enjoyed this showcase, and I will see you, hopefully, in the next update.